The soft chime of Melody's phone vibrated against her trembling hand as she stood outside the door of Henry Prescott's office. The golden letters of his name gleamed under the overhead lights, a stark reminder of the power and status he wielded. Melody took a deep breath, gathering the last bits of courage she could muster, and pushed the door open. Henry barely glanced up from his desk as she stepped in. He looked as he always did, sharp suit, immaculate desk, eyes focused on his work as if she were an afterthought. Melody cleared her throat, but her voice still came out quieter than planned. "Henry, I need to talk to you." "Melody," he replied without lifting his gaze. "Can this wait? I'm in the middle of something important." "This is important too," she said, her voice trembling. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Henry finally looked up, his expression shifting from vague irritation to something colder, sharper. He placed his pen down, folding his hands on the desk as he examined her. "And what exactly does that have to do with me?" he asked. His tone clipped. Melody felt her heart drop. She had known he could be dismissive, even harsh, but she hadn't expected this. "It's your child, Henry," she said, barely holding back the quiver in her voice. "I thought you'd want to know." Henry's face twisted, a sneer forming at the corner of his mouth. "A child? With you?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I knew you'd pull something like this. You think you're the first woman who's tried to trap me?" Shock turned to anger, and Melody took a step forward, clenching her fists. "This isn't a scheme, Henry. I thought you cared about me. About us." He scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down. "Us? There was never an us. Melody. There was me. And there was you. A distraction. A passing fling." His words cut into her like knives. But he didn't stop. "You really think I'd risk everything for he hesitated, his face hardening. "A black child?" The words hung in the air, each one striking her like a physical blow. She felt her face grow hot, her fists trembling with barely restrained fury. "How can you say that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what something like this could do to my reputation? I've worked too hard to build this empire. I won't let some mistake ruin it." "A mistake," she repeated, feeling the sting of tears but refusing to let them fall. "You call your own child a mistake?" Henry leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if dealing with a nuisance. "Melody, you should have thought about all of this before you got yourself into this mess. You have two options. Either you get rid of it, or you leave quietly." Her mouth went dry, and she shook her head in disbelief. I thought you cared about me." "Care?" he repeated, laughing bitterly. "Listen to me, Melody. I care about my image, my business, my family. Not you, and certainly not some child you're carrying. I'm not interested in playing house with you or anyone else. So take your sob story somewhere else." The words were harsh, each one colder than the last. She searched his face for some sign of remorse, some hint of the man she'd once thought she knew. But there was nothing, just a wall of indifference and pride. "What about the child?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. "What will you tell them one day?" Henry's expression turned icy, and he pointed toward the door. "There won't be any one day, because after today, you're gone." The finality in his words left her frozen in place. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make him see the cruelty of what he was doing, but she knew it was pointless. There was no humanity left in his gaze, no empathy or responsibility. Melody stood there, feeling her last shreds of hope crumble as security guards approached from behind. She didn't resist as they gently took her arms and began leading her toward the exit. She glanced back one last time, hoping to catch a flicker of regret, but Henry had already turned away, picking up his pen and resuming his work as if nothing had happened. The doors shut behind her with a final, deafening silence. Outside the office, she placed a hand over her stomach, a mix of sorrow and resolve settling over her. "Don't worry," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I'll protect you. I promise." As she walked out of the office building, she carried both the pain of betrayal and a new purpose, a promise to herself that her child would never have to feel the hurt she had just experienced. 27 years later, Melody sat by her kitchen window, her gaze distant as she watched the early morning light spill across the quiet street. She had kept her secret buried for nearly 3 decades, choosing silence over reopening the wound that Henry had left. For years, she avoided anything that could bring that chapter back to life. No reminders, no lingering thoughts, no mention of him. But as she heard the chime of her phone and saw Julian's name light up the screen, a familiar unease stirred within her. She forced a smile as she answered, "Good morning, sweetheart." "Mom, you're not going to believe it." Julian's voice was filled with excitement, almost breathless. She couldn't help but smile a little, hearing the joy in his voice. "Well, don't keep me waiting. Then, what's got you so happy?" "I got assigned as the lead attorney on a new case. A major one," he began, his voice swelling with pride. "Mom, this could be it, the case that gets my name out there. That makes people really notice me." "That's wonderful, Julian," she replied, but there was a nervous tremor in her voice. "Who's the client?" "Prescott Enterprises," he said, the name carrying reverence as if it held weight. "You know, the huge conglomerate. This could open up everything I've been working toward." Melody felt her breath hitch, the warmth draining from her face. "Prescott," she repeated, almost to herself. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, a trace of concern slipping into his voice. She forced herself to speak, keeping her voice steady. "Julian, I think we need to talk about this in person. Could you come over?" There was a slight pause. "Sure, of course," he said, uncertainty creeping into his tone. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, everything's fine," she replied quickly, masking the tension in her voice. "Just come over, please." After hanging up, Melody sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on her. She had never imagined she'd have to tell him this, never thought he'd get so close to the man who had turned his back on them. Julian arrived at her apartment soon after, his face still glowing with excitement despite his worry over her strange reaction. As he stepped inside, Melody met him with a forced smile, gesturing for him to take a seat at the small kitchen table. Her heart pounded, her hands cold, but she steeled herself. She couldn't hide this any longer. "Mom, you had me worried," he began, his brow furrowing. "What's going on? You looked like you'd seen a ghost when I mentioned Prescott Enterprises." Melody took a shaky breath, folding her hands tightly on the table. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling to find the right words. "Julian," she started, her voice soft. There's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something about your father." Julian's expression shifted, confusion flickering in his eyes. "My father," he echoed. "Mom, you told me he was out of the picture." "I did," she said, nodding. "But there's more to it than that. You see, your father is—" her voice caught, and she looked away, as if the truth itself were too bitter to speak. She swallowed, gathering her courage. "Your father is Henry Prescott." Julian froze, the shock washing over him. He stared at her, as if hoping she'd correct herself. Say she misspoke. "Henry Prescott?" His voice was a whisper, his face etched with disbelief. "You're saying the man I'm supposed to represent, the CEO of Prescott Enterprises, is my father?" Melody looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "He's the man who left us, who didn't want us." Julian's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. For years, all his life, he had wondered about the man who had disappeared, the one who had left his mother to raise him alone. He'd always assumed it was someone unremarkable, someone who'd simply vanished into obscurity. But this? A billionaire CEO? A man of power and influence who had the means to help yet chose to abandon them? "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he finally managed, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I didn't want you to carry that burden," Melody said, her own voice trembling. "Henry made it clear he wanted nothing to do with us. Especially not with she hesitated, "a black child. He said it would ruin his image." Julian felt a surge of anger, the bitter truth cutting deep. So he just left? Without a second thought? Melody nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. He didn't care. Julian, I begged him to at least acknowledge you, but he wouldn't listen. He fired me, told me to stay away, and I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I wanted you to grow up strong, without the weight of his rejection on your shoulders. Julian clenched his fists, his entire body tense with the rage simmering within him. So all these years, he was out there building his empire while we were left to fend for ourselves. Yes, Melody said, her voice heavy with pain. And he never looked back, never once reached out. Julian sat back, the reality settling over him like a dark cloud. The man he had admired from afar as a powerful corporate icon, the man he was eager to represent, was the same man who had turned his back on them, dismissing him as nothing more than an inconvenience. Mom, he said quietly, a dangerous edge to his tone. He's going to pay for this. Melody looked at him with worry in her eyes, reaching across the table to take his hand. Julian, please be careful. Henry's not the kind of man who will accept this quietly. He'll do anything to protect his reputation. Anything. Julian's eyes hardened, his jaw set with resolve. He can try, but he's not going to silence me. Not anymore. Melody's hand tightened around his. Just promise me. Promise you won't let this anger consume you. Julian met her gaze, nodding, though his mind was already racing with thoughts of confrontation. He had spent his whole life building himself up, determined to prove himself, to become someone who mattered. Now, he had a chance to expose the man who had abandoned him and make him face the consequences of his actions. As he left her apartment, a storm of emotions churned within him: anger, hurt, but above all, determination. This case was no longer just a career opportunity. It was a chance to confront his father and make him answer for his choices, and nothing was going to stop him.